The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nebraska cornfields as Jake Morrison walked the fence line of his 640-acre farm. The year was 1979, and the smell of diesel exhaust from his neighbor's brand-new John Deere drifted across the property line. Jake paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and glanced toward his own equipment shed where his father's 1952 Farmall M sat waiting for another day's work. At 34, Jake had inherited more than just land when his father passed 2 years earlier. He'd inherited a philosophy: son, debt is like quicksand. The harder you struggle against it, the deeper it pulls you down. But standing there, watching his neighbor's shiny new tractor effortlessly pull a 12-row planter while his own Farmall struggled with 6 rows, Jake wondered if his father's old-fashioned thinking was holding him back. The sound of gravel crunching under tires interrupted his thoughts. A black sedan pulled into his driveway, and out stepped Harold Brennan, the loan officer from First National Bank of Columbus. Harold's polished shoes seemed out of place on the dusty farmyard, but his smile was warm and familiar. "Morning, Jake," Harold called out, adjusting his tie against the morning breeze. "Beautiful day for farming, isn't it?" Jake nodded, curious about this unexpected visit. Harold wasn't the type to make house calls unless something big was happening. "What brings you out here, Harold? Bank business on a Saturday morning?" Harold's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a man carrying good news. "Actually, yes. I've got something that's going to change everything for farmers like you, Jake. The government's rolled out a new agricultural modernization program, and I wanted you to be among the first to hear about it." They walked toward the equipment shed, Harold's city shoes clicking against the concrete floor. The Farmall M sat there like an old faithful dog, its red paint faded but its engine still strong. Harold glanced at it with barely concealed disdain. "Jake, how old is this tractor?" 27 years, Jake replied, running his hand along the worn steering wheel. "Dad bought it new in '52. Still runs like the day he drove it off the lot." Harold nodded politely, but Jake could see the wheels turning in the banker's mind. "That's impressive longevity. But Jake, think about what you could accomplish with modern equipment. Your neighbor Tom just picked up a new John Deere 4440 through our program. 130 horsepower, air-conditioned cab, power steering. He's going to plant twice as much in half the time." Jake had seen Tom's new tractor. It was impressive, no doubt about it. But he also remembered his father's words about the difference between wanting something and needing it. "What kind of program are we talking about, Harold?" Harold's smile widened. 0% financing, Jake. You heard me right. 0% for qualified farmers on new equipment purchases. The government is backing these loans as part of an initiative to modernize American agriculture and increase productivity. The words hung in the air like morning mist. 0% financing. Jake had never heard of such a thing. Even the most creditworthy borrowers paid at least prime rate, which was hovering around 12% in 1979. This seemed too good to be true. "How is that possible?" Jake asked, his natural skepticism kicking in. Harold pulled out a leather portfolio and began spreading papers on the workbench. The Agricultural Modernization Act of 1979. Congress passed it 6 months ago. The idea is to help American farmers compete globally by upgrading their equipment. The government subsidizes the interest for the first year, and after that, well, most farmers find that their increased productivity more than covers the payments. Jake studied the glossy brochures Harold had laid out. Pictures of massive tractors, combines, and implements filled the pages. The numbers were staggering, machines that cost more than his father had paid for the entire farm back in 1945. "What's the catch, Harold?" "There's always a catch." Harold laughed, but there was something forced about it. "No catch, Jake. Just an opportunity. Look, I'll be honest with you. The bank has quotas to meet on these loans. The government wants to see rapid adoption of this program. That's why I'm here on a Saturday morning, talking to farmers I know and trust. Jake picked up one of the brochures featuring a John Deere 4640. The price tag made his stomach tighten, $45,000. That was more money than he'd seen in his entire life. His father had bought their farm for $12,000 and thought he was being extravagant. $45,000, Jake said quietly. That's a lot of money, Harold. But think about it as an investment, not an expense, Harold countered quickly. With that tractor, you could farm twice as much land. Maybe lease some additional acreage from neighbors who are getting too old to work it themselves. The increased revenue would easily cover the payments. Jake walked over to his farmall and patted its hood. This old girl has never missed a payment because there weren't any payments to miss. Dad always said the best payment is no payment. Harold's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. Jake, I respect your father's memory, but times are changing. The farmers who don't modernize are going to be left behind. Look around, everyone's upgrading. Tom, the Hendersons, the Kowalskis. Even old Pete Jorgensen bought a new combine last month. The pressure was subtle but real. Jake could feel it building like storm clouds on the horizon. He'd noticed the new equipment appearing on neighboring farms, heard the talk at the grain elevator about increased productivity and efficiency. Was he being stubborn, or was he being wise? Tell me more about the terms, Jake said finally. Harold's face brightened immediately. Excellent. Okay, here's how it works. 0% for the first 12 months. After that, the rate adjusts to market conditions, but we're talking about maybe 8 to 10%, which is still very reasonable for equipment financing. Jake's father had taught him to listen not just to what people said, but to how they said it. Harold had rushed through that last part about the rate adjustment, almost as if he hoped Jake wouldn't notice. What exactly does market conditions mean? Jake asked. Harold shuffled through his papers, suddenly less confident. Well, it's tied to the prime rate, plus a small margin for the bank's administrative costs. Nothing unusual there. And what's the prime rate today? Around 12%, but economists are predicting it will come down as inflation stabilizes. Jake did quick math in his head. If the rate jumped to even 15% after the first year, the payments on a $45,000 tractor would be crushing. So after 12 months, I could be looking at payments of what, $800 a month? Harold waved his hand dismissively. Jake, you're thinking too negatively. By then, your increased productivity will have more than offset any payment increases. Besides, equipment values are appreciating so fast that if you ever needed to, you could sell and probably break even or even make a profit. Something about Harold's tone bothered Jake. It reminded him of the way his father used to talk about politicians, lots of promises, but always with an escape clause hidden in the fine print. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Outside, Jake could hear the distant rumble of Tom's new tractor working the far field. The sound was smooth and powerful, nothing like the rhythmic chug of his old farmall. I need to think about this, Harold, Jake said finally. Harold's smile faltered slightly. Of course, of course. But Jake, I have to be honest with you, this program has limited funding. Once the government allocation is exhausted, that's it. No more 0% deals. I'd hate for you to miss out because you waited too long. The urgency in Harold's voice triggered something in Jake's memory. His father had once told him about a traveling salesman who tried to sell him a revolutionary new plow back in 1955. The salesman had used the same tactics, limited time offer, act now or lose out forever. His father had sent the man packing and bought a used plow from a neighbor for half the price. That plow had served them well for over 20 years. How long do I have to decide? Jake asked. Well, ideally, I'd like to get the paperwork started this week. The approval process takes time, and like I said, funding is limited. Jake nodded slowly. I appreciate you thinking of me, Harold. Let me talk it over with my wife and get back to you. Harold gathered his papers, clearly disappointed that he wasn't leaving with a signed contract. Don't wait too long, Jake. Opportunities like this don't come around often. After Harold's sedan disappeared down the gravel road, Jake stood alone in his equipment shed. The Farmel M seemed to regard him with patient understanding, as if it knew the thoughts running through his mind. He climbed up onto the worn seat and gripped the steering wheel, feeling the smooth spots where his father's hands had worn the metal. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Mary, discussing Harold's visit. Mary was a practical woman, the daughter of a banker herself, and she understood numbers better than most. 0% does sound attractive, she admitted, reviewing the brochures Harold had left behind. But Jake, look at these payment amounts after the first year. Even at 10%, we'd be paying over $600 a month. That's more than our mortgage. Jake nodded. And that's assuming the rate stays at 10%. Harold seemed pretty vague about what market conditions might bring. Mary set down the brochure and looked at her husband seriously. What would your father have done? It was a question Jake had been asking himself all afternoon. His father, Robert Morrison, had been a cautious man, shaped by the Great Depression and 2 world wars. He'd built their farm slowly, paying cash for everything, never owing a penny to anyone. Dad would have asked more questions, Jake said finally. He always said that when someone's pushing you to make a quick decision, that's usually when you should slow down and think harder. The next morning, Jake drove into Columbus to visit Harold at the bank. The First National Building was the tallest structure in town, its brick facade speaking of stability and permanence. Harold's office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking Main Street. Jake. Harold stood up from behind his desk, clearly pleased to see him. I was hoping you'd come in. Have you made a decision? Jake settled into the chair across from Harold's desk. I've got some questions first. Harold's smile remained fixed, but Jake noticed a slight tension around his eyes. Of course. Fire away. You mentioned that the rate adjusts to market conditions after the first year. What's the maximum rate I could be charged? Harold shuffled through a stack of papers on his desk. Well, there's a cap built into the contract. Let me see, here it is. The rate cannot exceed 24% annually. 24%. Jake felt his stomach drop. At that rate, the monthly payments would be over $1,200. No farm could sustain that kind of debt service. Has anyone actually hit that cap? Jake asked. Harold's discomfort was becoming more obvious. Well, that's really just a worst-case scenario. We don't expect rates to go anywhere near that high. But they could. Theoretically, yes. But Jake, you're worrying about something that's extremely unlikely to happen. Jake leaned back in his chair, thinking. His father had always told him that contracts were written for worst-case scenarios, not best-case ones. What happens if I can't make the payments? The question hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Harold's smile finally disappeared completely. Well, like any secured loan, the equipment would serve as collateral. But Jake, that's not something you need to worry about. Your farm is solid, your credit is excellent. So if I can't pay, you take the tractor. In extreme circumstances, yes. But we work with our customers, Jake. We want you to succeed. Jake stood up slowly. Harold, I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll stick with what I've got for now. Harold's face flushed slightly. Jake, you're making a mistake. This opportunity won't come again. Your neighbors are all moving forward while you're standing still. Maybe so, Jake replied calmly. But I'd rather stand still on solid ground than move forward into quicksand. As Jake walked out of the bank, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The pressure to modernize, to keep up with his neighbors, to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, it all fell away. He thought about his father's words, "Son, the best deal is often the one you don't make." Over the following months, Jake watched as his neighbors took delivery of their new equipment. The fields around his farm filled with the sight and sound of modern machinery. Tom's new John Deere, the Henderson's case tractor, Pete Jorgensen's massive combine, they were impressive machines, no doubt about it. But Jake also began to notice other things. Tom seemed more stressed than usual, constantly worried about weather delays that might affect his ability to make payments. The Hendersons started working longer hours, trying to farm additional rented land to generate enough income to service their debt. Pete Jorgensen, who had always been one of the most relaxed farmers in the county, now checked grain prices obsessively, his mood rising and falling with the commodity markets. Jake continued farming with his 1952 Farmel M. It wasn't the fastest or the most comfortable, but it was reliable, and most importantly, it was paid for. When equipment broke down, Jake fixed it himself in his shop. When parts were needed, he found them at salvage yards or had them machined locally. His operating costs remained low, and every dollar of revenue went toward improving his land or building his savings account. The first sign of trouble came in the spring of 1981. Interest rates, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly spiked. The prime rate hit 20%, and the adjustable rates on the agricultural loans followed suit. Jake heard the news at the grain elevator, where the usual morning coffee conversation had turned grim. 22%, Tom said, staring into his coffee cup. My payment just went from $400 to over $900 a month. Pete Jorgensen nodded grimly. Mine's even worse. The bank says it's temporary, that rates will come back down, but how long can we hold on? Jake listened to his neighbor's struggles with a mixture of sympathy and relief. He thought about Harold's assurances that rates would never go that high, about the extremely unlikely, worst-case scenarios that were now becoming reality. By the fall of 1982, the agricultural crisis was in full swing. Commodity prices had collapsed while interest rates remained punishingly high. The combination was devastating for farmers carrying heavy debt loads. Jake watched as, for sale, signs began appearing on farms throughout the county. Tom was the first of Jake's immediate neighbors to go under. The bank foreclosed on his farm in November, seizing not just the new John Deere but the land itself to satisfy the debt. Tom and his family moved to town, where he took a job at the grain elevator, working for wages on the same land he had once owned. The Hendersons lasted until the following spring before they too were forced to sell. Pete Jorgensen managed to hang on by selling his new combine and most of his cattle, but he was a shadow of his former self, aged 10 years in the span of 2. Throughout this period, Jake's farm remained stable. His costs were low, his debt was zero, and his old Farmel M kept running. When neighbors needed help, Jake was there with his equipment and his labor. When good land came up for sale at distressed prices, Jake had the cash to buy it. By 1985, Jake had quietly assembled one of the largest farming operations in the county. He owned 1,200 acres outright, all purchased with cash from farmers who had been forced to sell. His equipment was still old, but it was reliable and paid for. Most importantly, he slept well at night, knowing that no banker could take away what he had built. One morning in the spring of 1986, Jake was working in his shop when a familiar black sedan pulled into his driveway. Harold Brennan stepped out, looking considerably older and more worn than he had 7 years earlier. The banking crisis had taken its toll on everyone, including the bankers themselves. "Hello, Jake," Harold said quietly. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag and nodded toward 2 chairs he kept by his workbench. "Not at all, Harold. Coffee?" They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 men who had lived through difficult times. Finally, Harold spoke. "I owe you an apology, Jake. That loan program, it destroyed a lot of good farmers. People I'd known my whole life." Jake studied Harold's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "You believed in it, Harold. You thought you were helping." "I should have asked the same question you did," Harold said. "What happens if they can't pay?" I should have looked at those worst-case scenarios more carefully. We all make mistakes, Jake replied. The important thing is learning from them. Harold stood to leave, then paused. Jake, can I ask you something? How did you know? How did you see what the rest of us missed? Jake thought for a moment, then walked over to his Farmel M. He patted its hood affectionately. My father taught me that the most important question isn't what can I gain, but what can I lose. When Harold offered me that loan, I kept thinking about what I could lose, my farm, my independence, my peace of mind. The potential gains never seemed worth those risks. Harold nodded slowly. Your father was a wise man. He was, Jake agreed. But the wisdom wasn't really his. It came from hard experience, from living through the depression, from watching other people make mistakes he was determined not to repeat. As Harold's car disappeared down the gravel road, Jake reflected on the lessons of the past 7 years. The agricultural crisis had reshaped the entire county. Many of the old farming families were gone, their land now owned by larger operations or outside investors. The social fabric of the community had been torn apart by foreclosures and bankruptcies. But there had been survivors, and they shared certain characteristics. They had avoided excessive debt, maintained diverse income sources, and focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term growth. They had asked hard questions and demanded honest answers. Most importantly, they had been willing to be different, to resist the pressure to follow the crowd. Jake's success hadn't come from superior farming skills or lucky timing. It had come from asking one simple question at the right moment: what happens if I can't pay? That question had revealed the true nature of the generous loan offer and saved his farm from the fate that befell so many others. As he walked back toward his house for lunch, Jake could see his field stretching to the horizon. The corn was coming up strong, and the weather looked favorable for the growing season. His old Farmel M sat ready for another day's work, as reliable as ever. That evening, Jake's son Michael, now 16 and helping with the farm work, asked his father about the new tractor dealership that had opened in town. Dad, they've got some really nice equipment. Maybe we should take a look. Jake smiled, remembering his own youthful enthusiasm for shiny new machinery. We might do that, son. But first, let me teach you the most important question a farmer can ask before making any big purchase. Michael looked up expectantly. What happens if we can't pay? It was a simple question, but Jake knew it contained the wisdom of generations. In a world full of attractive offers and easy credit, the ability to see past the promises to the potential consequences was perhaps the most valuable skill a person could possess. The lesson wasn't just about farming or tractors or bank loans. It was about the fundamental difference between wants and needs, between growth and sustainability, between following the crowd and thinking for yourself. It was about understanding that sometimes the best decision is the one that keeps you from having to make harder decisions later. As the sun set over the Nebraska plains, Jake Morrison sat on his porch, watching his paid-for farm stretch out before him. He thought about his neighbors who had lost everything, about the bankers who had believed their own promises, about the government programs that had promised prosperity but delivered ruin. But mostly, he thought about his father's wisdom and the power of asking the right question at the right time. In a world that often rewarded risk-taking and aggressive growth, Jake had found success through caution and careful thinking. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured by the size of your equipment or the scope of your operation, but by your ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that what you had built was truly yours. The question that had saved his farm, what happens if I can't pay, had become more than just a financial safeguard. It had become a philosophy, a way of approaching life that valued security over speculation, substance over style, and wisdom over wealth. And as Jake prepared to pass that wisdom on to the next generation, he knew that his father's legacy would continue, one careful decision at a time. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, activating notifications to be alerted when new videos are published. God bless you.